Hey guys, welcome back to another build video here. In this video, we're going to see how I made this awesome Oedura fimbria enclosure. So stick around. This video was brought to you from Morelia Geckos. This video was also really heavily inspired by Coop's recent pygmy python enclosure build. A link to his video tutorial will be put in the description down below. Before we go any further with this build, let's cross to a guy that's been in the field and actually seen these animals in the wild, and also filmed them. So a massive thank you to Frank from Reptilian Diaries for letting us have a look at this footage.
Welcome to Reptilian Diaries. I'm Frank. We do reptiles here. Today, we're doing a closer look episode on Oedura fimbria, the western velvet gecko. Rocky canyons, rocky outcrops, you gotta have rocks. In the Australian desert, there's not tons of rocks generally, so when you do find a rocky outcropping in the west, the northwest, you're gonna find these guys. Just about every rocky outcropping that we visited, once we were in their range, we found them. We found them as far south as Kew area, and we found them all the way up north of Karajini National Park, and west to, I don't even remember where, Whim Creek or something like that.
So with building a lot of these backgrounds out of this bastion insulation board, you end up with a few spare offcuts. I'm going to build this enclosure using a 60 by 45 by 45 centimeter Exoterra enclosure. As you can see, I'm using my hot wire cutter, which is one of my favourite tools, to really carve out a lot of these layers of foam. This is what really inspired me from one of Coop's recent videos on his pygmy python build, is how he kind of cut the foam individually and then glued them into place once he'd actually worked on them. I used silicone on the back face of the Exoterra to actually glue them into place. This just helped bind to the glass. I had pre-figured out the kind of layering technique that I'd wanted to do and the kind of structure that I wanted on the floor of the garage. And then I just repeated the structure and put it into the enclosure itself. I used a little Gorilla Glue in between the layers of foam just to help tack them together to really bond them. You can really see the main structure of the background come into life here. It's important for these geckos to have security, so I'm incorporating a few little holes and crevices inside of this background for these geckos to be able to retreat into during the daytime. Now I could have left the texture as is on the rockwork, but I decided to really rough it up, doing it really similar to how Coop did it in his video, and this really does make the tile pointing stick to it really nicely, and it also gives it a very natural looking effect at the end of it. You've got to remember guys, not all rocks in nature are actually smooth. So now we're starting on the first layer of tile pointing. This is a bit of a watered down layer, so it goes on a little bit thinner than most. I actually use a spray bottle with a bit of water in there to kind of help the tile pointing get even further down in those cracks and crevices. So for the second layer of tile pointing, I've mixed in some red brick oxide. This is starting to just give the enclosure a bit of colour. The consistency of this layer is a lot different to the first layer. It's a little bit thicker, a little bit more like a nice thick cake batter. Round number 3. So this is the final layer of tile pointing that I'm actually going to put on top of this enclosure. And with this layer, I actually end up doing a little bit of a dimpling effect with the paintbrush as well, just to kind of rough up the edge that's actually going on there so you don't see any of the paint strokes or anything like that. I think paint strokes can actually be used to an advantage in some styles of enclosures, but this one in particular, I wanted it to look much like Frank's videos where it was pretty rough. Now you can see I'm using some more offcuts here. I'm actually just gluing them all back together so I can actually carve out some rocks. I wanted a couple of big kind of feature rocks inside of this enclosure just to give the dimensions a little bit of a different depth. I didn't want it to be all just about the background. I wanted there to be a nice big boulder that I could have at the front there so we could see these geckos climbing around on top of that boulder, and another little feature rock as well. So all I did was use the same process again, cutting out the foam with the hot wire cutter as best as I can. I burnt it again with the soldering iron, and from there I coated it with 3 coats of tile pointing and roughed it up with the same sort of dimpling effect. You can see the dimpling effect really well on the front side of this rock. The previous rock that you saw there, that was actually the back side of it drying whilst it had the tile pointing on there. This has to be my favourite part of any build. I really get down with, just getting creative with some paints and just seeing what I can do and seeing how far I can kind of push my abilities. You can see here that I'm using an old dry brush, which I had probably used as the main dimpling brush for this enclosure. I'm going to use it for a dry brush as well. So dry brushing, essentially all you're doing is getting a little bit of paint on the end of your brush, getting as much of it off as you can so it is a little bit more of a drier consistency, and then you're going to use that to stipple it all over the enclosure. If you do this enough and with enough layers, you can build up some pretty interesting looking painting techniques. It's a good idea to hit different edges on the rock faces with different colours as well, just to kind of bring out different shades. The more of this you do and the more of the layering techniques you use, it will eventually all kind of blend together really nicely and look very natural. On this build I used an array of different acrylic paints, mainly different shades of browns, oranges, even some yellows and some pinks. You can see it's really starting to blend in and look like a natural rock face now. When you're using the dry brush technique in the same sort of manner that I'm doing, it's always best to work from your darkest colour through to your lightest. So you would have noticed that I started with dark browns, even through sort of kind of darkish reddish oranges. Now I'm going through on some yellows, and I'll end up finishing it off with a little bit of white as well, just to really highlight some of the rock faces. Okay, now you're all going to think I'm crazy. It looks like I'm painting this whole enclosure black. Well, I'm not. I'm painting it with a bit of diluted acrylic black paint, and I'm actually using my Mister bottle or my spray bottle to kind of help it run all down into the rock faces and into the crevices. And it's a little bit nerve-wracking because you don't know necessarily how dark it's actually going to end up turning out. So I always try to do a bit of a lighter wash and work my way backwards, so you can always make a wash darker. It's a lot harder to get dark paint off an already painted background. So as you can see, I'm just painting this very ad lib, and then I'm relying on the water to get it into all the crevices. You can see it didn't actually turn out being that dark in that particular wash, so I was quite happy with this. And I decided to lighten up a few of the areas that I thought were maybe just a little bit too dark for my liking. And I just used some of the same tile pointing mixed with the red oxide, just to use that as a little bit of a highlight colour over the top of some of the darker areas. This is in any area that you kind of have like a really harsh black spot or something like that, where an actual dollop of paint has gotten. This is a good way to kind of just fix that up right now. So onto some fun stuff. For this enclosure's main substrate, I'm actually just using mainly some of AK Custom Background's bioactive or arid bioactive soil mix. I've been very lucky enough to have been given a couple of bags of this to test out by Ash, and so far I'm really impressed with this stuff. This enclosure I'm actually going to be doing a bit more of a naturalistic setup, so that's why you're not seeing like a drainage layer or anything there. It will have a live plant or two in here, but nothing too crazy that's going to really rely on a lot of water. I'm actually just mixing a few other substrates in with Ash's substrate. I'm going to be using a little bit of eucalyptus mulch through here, as well as a bit of red reptile sand and pink granite. I feel a little bit bad mixing this in with Ash's stuff, but it's just to try to get that real natural look to it. I'm yet to find another product that does legitimately make the soil nice and red, such as the red reptile sand. For this enclosure, I'm just going to use a couple of little ficuses, nothing too crazy, but I just wanted to pop a greenery just to kind of really offset the reds. These guys don't require a lot of water and they survive under a whole range of conditions, so I have no doubt that these guys are going to be fine with being watered maybe once or twice a week in this shallow substrate. Mixing a little bit of the substrate in with the actual background itself and getting it in the cracks of the background can kind of just help blend the two together. So using the same methods that I used on the background in the enclosure itself, I went ahead and painted up these rocks to make sure that they matched nice and thoroughly. While we're watching this painting segment, I will add that I'm actually going to be running a 5.0 ReptiSun Zoom Ed UVB tube above these geckos just to give them the option of a bit of UVB, and I'm also going to be using a small downlight above the plants just to make sure that they've got adequate light for growth and survival as well. There's nothing quite like some natural leaf litter and a few little twigs to really make this enclosure pop. I think every enclosure really needs some sort of leaf litter or some sort of substrate on top of the actual core substrate in the enclosure. This always just kind of helps bring a different sort of element to the enclosure, and it definitely makes it give it that more natural appeal. And a little thing like this can just go so far with making these enclosures look fantastic. Okay, so it's time for the stars of the show. Oedura fimbria, the western marble velvet gecko. These are such stunning little geckos, and these guys were bred by Rick Worthy from Worthy Geckos. I couldn't have been happier with these little animals. As far as velvet geckos go, they're definitely one of my favourites and definitely one of the most colourful varieties out there, especially as juveniles. I'm looking forward to working with Rick down the line as a new channel sponsor on here, as I feel like there's going to be a few cool little animals cropping up here and there.
So guys, if you enjoy these kind of build videos, make sure to subscribe down below, make sure to comment on the video, make sure to like the video, make sure to go and check out Teespring and Patreon as well, because you're going to be getting a bit more content and some merchandise and stuff over on there. So from me and my little Oeduras over here, we're going to see you on the next video. Take it easy.
Look out, here she comes, the woman that I love. It's too bad she'll never know. Yeah, I can't tell her how I feel, because she has someone who makes her happy. I'm a ghost in these walls, or at least I try to be. 'Cause I hope that I'm not sure.